Good afternoon, everybody. This is Talking Institutions with Nauro Campus at the University College London. And today we are absolutely delighted to have Professor Gerard Roland from the University of California, Berkeley. And Gerard, it's great to have you here. Really looking forward to start asking you, from your vast experience and the transition economies.
Mhm.
If you could tell us, if you can have to briefly describe this first 30 years of transition exclusively from the optics of institutions, right? What do you think are the elements that one needs to really pay attention to?
So thank you very much. Yes, indeed. The transition experience is something we learned a lot from, both from a policy point of view but also for economic theory. I grew up, at least, my generation, we grew up with general equilibrium theory being the foundations, sort of microeconomic foundations of economics. And essentially, this is how prices react to supply and demand in different markets and their interactions, etc. Another way of saying that is price theory. Price theory is trying to explain everything by supply, demand, and prices. And this was kind of, fundamental. And so therefore, when there was the beginning of the transition from central planning to the market economy, naturally, economists say one of the first things you have to do is to liberalize prices, because if you liberalize prices, then supplies and demands are going to adjust. And because there was so much shortages, inefficiencies before, then we're only going to see increase in output and increase in efficiency. Instead, what we saw is that after prices were liberalized, there was a huge output fall. And so this is something, it took quite a while for people to understand what was going on. And then we realized, actually, to understand this, you have to go back to institutional economics, work by Commons, North, Williamson, etc., where they had been looking not so much at price theory, but at institutions as the rules of the game. And so indeed, it's the rules of the game. And instead of looking at markets, which presupposes already institutions, information, etc., you have to look at transactions. And to look at transactions, you have to look at transaction costs and what are the obstacles for people to contract, to do business together. And this is the rules of the game. That's what institutions are all about. And we saw, actually, in the transition experience, that when they liberalized prices, because they had not been institutional foundations for the market economy, they just were not there, then essentially there was just a fall in output because it was just chaotic. Some people who had been in production chains, they just went away from those production chains, they collapsed. So it was very chaotic. Price theory, general equilibrium theory, cannot make sense of that. But if you look at institutions, if you look at contract theory, then you can understand why that took place. And so there are very general lessons. Instead of looking at the market economy essentially as supply, demand, prices, it's really more about the rules of the game, institutions. What are the obstacles, but also the rules that can help to improve transactions. And this is actually quite fundamental. Just after that, there was a very famous article by Acemoglu Johnson Robinson, which also showed empirically that institutions matter for growth. But I have to say that with the transition experience, we really saw it in real life. All the economies that liberalized at once their markets, they saw this huge fall in demand. And this has completely changed the way we look at market economy, at capitalism as a system. And so for those who care about it, this was really a big change.
This is excellent. Let me move more recently now and looking at a bit more specifically at institutions. And one of your important recent research streams is on the relationship between culture and growth, right? And can you give us a little bit more details on that line of research, in particularly the kind of causality design, and what are the main results in your view?
When we talk about institutions, there are formal institutions. These are written rules. This is the law. These are constitutions. But there are also informal institutions, and and how people behave towards each other. What kind of behavioral norms they are following. And this is related to culture. Culture is about the values people have, what gives meaning to my life, about their beliefs, how do I think other people will behave. And so the very early research by economists on culture was about trust. One has found that in some countries, people are generally have more trust towards others, not just their neighbors, not just their family, their country people, their ethnic group, but very generally, it's called generalized trust. And what I have done, what I found out, is that there really is a very strong correlation between the two different types of cultures we see in the world. That is individualist cultures versus collectivist cultures. Individualist cultures give social status for people who stand out, to stand out, being a famous researcher, becoming a rich person, becoming a famous rock star or artist, whatever it is, philanthropist, whatever it is, but to stand out. So people derive pride and status, and so this is an aspiration to stand out. These are individualist cultures. Collectivist cultures are cultures that emphasize more fitting in the group, conformity, and they are more critical of people wanting to stand out. So these are really different cultures. Western countries are more individualistic. Asian countries tend to be more individualistic, but there are differences. So, for example, India is the most individualist culture among Asian countries, also among the developing countries. And so there's a lot of variation across the world, but also within continents. So in Latin America, for example, Argentina is more individualistic, but Peru, Bolivia, country from the Andes region, they're more collectivist. And so what one found is that there is actually a correlation between culture and growth. So we see that the countries that have had the fastest growth over the last hundreds of years, so this is really long run growth. We're not looking at 30, 40, 50 years. We're looking over hundreds of years. So there's a strong positive correlation between individualism and long run growth. Now, the question people ask, what's the causality? What is the way, is it that culture influences growth, or is it the fact that growth influences culture? Is the fact that people have an individualist culture that makes them want to stand out, is that going to be a drive for innovation? And we know that the real secret, the drive for growth is really innovation. So are people going to innovate not only because, of course, the money behind it, that's the capitalist system, but also because they get fame and, out of it. So is individualism going to be the source, going to be a fundamental driver of innovation and thus long-run growth? Or does it go the other way around? That is, when countries become richer, then people pay more attention to themselves, and maybe growth and the abundance of material products makes people individualistic. So this is an important question. Which way does the causality go? And so with my colleague Gorodnichenko, we have done some modeling, but also some empirical work And so using the instrumental variable approach. And so I'll just give you two examples of variables that we've been looking at. It turns out that if you look at, and this is very recent, if you look at the genetic composition of populations, it turns out that in some countries, there is a variant of a gene that makes people more depressed or suffer more from depression when they are faced with stressful situation. And this is just a variant of a gene. It turns out, this is interesting, that that gene, that variant of the gene is much more present in collectivist cultures. Okay, so that if you're faced with a stressful situation, your psychological suffering will be larger. Now, there's again, we look at another variant of a gene that makes people suffer more psychologically from psychological exclusion. If you're bullied by others, if you're, if you're humiliated, then that variant of the gene makes you suffer more. Okay, so these are two examples: depression, suffering from exclusion, etc. It turns out that those variants of genes are more present in collectivist countries. Okay, this is just history. There's a lot of random mutations, etc., and these genes are more present in collectivist countries. Interestingly, those countries also have lower suicide rates. Now, that seems to contradict the fact that their genetic predisposition should lead actually to more suicides. Mm-hmm. And so what have we learned from that? And biologists, psychologists have been looking at it, that actually these communities, collectivities, have developed collectivist culture as a response to these genetic frameworks. So if you suffer more from depression when you're laden with stress, then the community that will set up rules so that people will be less faced with stressful situations where they're being taken over by the community, but also have less freedom, a bit more rigid structure. And this is actually what the collectivist culture does. Same thing about social exclusion. You will have social rules so that people are not going to be excluded. So in a way, you can see the culture, the collectivist culture, as a response to the genetic composition that is more frequent in the population. And so this gene, has nothing to do, these variants of genes, they have nothing to do with economic growth, with innovation, etc. But they can really explain why some countries are more collectivist than others. And so we found that using those as instrumental variables, we can determine that there is a causal influence of culture on long-run economic growth. That's quite interesting. In other work that we haven't published, and I don't know if we will ever publish it, we found that countries with collectivist culture have a comparative advantage in innovation-intensive sectors, whereas countries with a more collectivist culture, they have an advantage in complexity of manufacturing. And so, this could explain why Asia has become the manufacturing hub of the world. You see China, they produce our iPads, our computers, etc. There's very little reject. Similarly, 20, 30 years ago, Japanese cars were better than American cars because the culture kind of makes people work together. They are more cooperative and things like that. So I think that's that's about it. It turns out that, just to put some perspective here, that for quite a while, economists were really not willing to engage in research on culture. You had the Chicago people, Becker, Stigler saying, preferences are given. We don't discuss where those preferences come from. That's not our role, etc. But cultural differences are so important to today's world, especially if you compare now China with other countries. China has been growing very, very much, and it has a more collectivist culture. And by the way, there's a very interesting book by Joe Henrich, who's both a psychologist and anthropologist, called Weird, meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, where he kind of gives a survey of all the literature showing this difference between individualist and collectivist culture. Right. And so, in a way, Yuri and myself, we have been playing, we have been basing our research on what psychologists have done before to look at issues that they have not looked at.
Right. But in addition to growth and innovation, my understanding was that you also have some really nice political economy results in terms of the implications of culture to democracy, to democratization, correct?
Yes, that's so let me get to that.
All right.
Now, in political science, one of the biggest, most famous theories in political science is modernization theory. And so modernization theory says that when countries grow, when they become richer, they become more democratic. There has been a lot of evidence for that. So I don't want to contest it, but we do see, for example, that some of the countries that have had the fastest growth in the last few decades, again, China is a huge part of the world, but also, Vietnam and other countries, they did not become more democratic as they have been growing. And let me just take the example of China. Many people like me thought that with the miraculous economic growth, going from a poor country to now, really a high income country, that following modernization theory, China would become more democratic. But it's not the case. It's not the case. So in a way, again, with Yuri, we built a theory looking at collective action. So when there is collective action, you have demonstration, protests. Looks what's happening in Myanmar today, for example. There was the Arab Spring, and there are many examples. So the question is, when you have these moments of collective action, which happen once in a while, they don't happen all the time, will you tend to see after success of those collective actions, are they going to lead to a transformation towards democracy, or instead towards new leaders trying to improve autocracy, etc.? And it turns out that in collectivist countries, there is this idea that you can have a good autocrat, bad autocrat, the good emperor, the bad emperor. So when you have a bad emperor, the bad emperor loses the mandate of heaven, as they say in China. And then you want a new emperor, a good emperor. Okay. Now it turns out, so countries that have a collectivist culture, they, in their values, they put more value on essentially, having a good autocrat, a good emperor. And they are somewhat wary of democracy because of the instability it could create, etc. And so, with this model, we found that countries with an individualist culture, over time, they will always converge towards democracy. That's modernization theory. But countries with collectivist culture, less often. Okay, so this is all probabilistic, less often. So take countries like Japan, Korea, they became democratic. Indonesia is a very collectivist country, became democratic for now. But you do see that China is not moving, Vietnam is not moving, and the same with other countries. And so we found that indeed countries with individualist culture have tended to democratize earlier. This is not a deterministic theory. This is a theory about probabilities. Okay, so there's no iron rule here that says that countries with a collectivist culture can never become democratic. It's just, they're less likely to, or they will democratize potentially later on. And when we see what's happening in China, Xi Jinping has been continuing the economic growth, but he has been really reinforcing China's autocratic system. And I think, we have to say that modernization theory cannot hold if you do not take into account cultural differences. And so that can explain a certain lack of convergence towards democracy. People were very optimistic for a while that all countries will become democratic. There was kind of, convergence towards more democracy, 3 waves of democratization in the 20th century. But more recently, that's not been the case. And we do see that, there are rich autocracies that emerge. And I think our theory can explain that.
Yes, and I mean, another implication of this very interesting and insightful line of research is, I mean, looking at populism instead of democratization today, and from the cultural side, identity, right? And I mean, you have done some recent work on that. I mean, on the relationship between identity politics and populism. Can you tell us about the main gist of this work?
So what we have seen is within democratic countries, rich countries, there's been a wave of populism, forms of, identity politics, white supremacists, being hostility towards immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So good examples are Brexit. So the basis for Brexit was to make Britain British again, get the migrants out, or, at least, less immigration. And in the US, Trump, certainly that's an important example. So this wave towards populism and identity politics really, has been there always, but took off really after the 2008 crisis. Okay, and so 2008 crisis is the worst. Well, now we have the worst now with the pandemic, but since the 1930s, the 2008 crisis was the worst that we have experienced. It was not as bad as 30s, but still very bad. In the US, millions of people lost their job, lost their home, and so there's been really economic hardship. And that's true also for a lot of regions in England, regions in France, East Germany, many other regions. And so there's been a lot of research on this. There are now hundreds of papers. And so we did the survey. And so there's a question, is the explanation for this emergence of populism and identity politics, is it economic or is it cultural? So is it economic? That is it as a result of the economic hardships that people become frustrated and then they follow these populist slogans, which are economically misguided, but certainly that people get to follow? Or is it related to culture? Is the fact that there's been cultural evolution, quite a lot in the last 50 years, tolerance of different forms of sexuality, LGBTQIA+, the women's rights, etc. Women fighting for the right to work, for really equality between genders, multiculturalism, etc. And so these populists, these defenders of identity politics, they have been raging against those changes. Really, they have been raging against those changes. So the question, what's happening? And so what we found, looking a little bit at the literature, is that research looking at economic factors, that is, jobs, GDP per capita, income per capita in different regions. Now we can measure these things pretty well. They show that there is more populism in regions where there was more economic hardship. So that's number one. On the other hand, research based on surveys, asking people, what do you think of immigration, women's rights, all those things, found that there's a very strong cultural component. So how do we kind of put these things together? What we suggested in the article is that actually the fundamental cause of populism is economic, which can be good news, because if the economy improves, then it may disappear, or if other concerns come up, this may disappear. But political parties have been exploiting these economic hardships by coming up with their own program, which is racist, bigotry, all those things. And that was very appealing to people who have suffered hardship. So this combination is that the fundamental cause is economic, but then parties that have different ideologies that are precisely based on, white supremacy or populism, etc., have been exploiting it. And so that's how we see the literature so far. In another work that I've done, we even saw that in the European Parliament, where for more than 30 years, the main dimension of politics was left-right, like it is in every mature democracy, during a short period of 5 years has been more, nationalism, that is based on, identity politics. So that seems to have been, the main. So basically, those who are against free trade, those who are against free mobility, against immigration, against the EU, etc., versus those who go in the other way around. Yeah, so that's about it right now. I think part of the research on populism is kind of fading, because populist parties really did not do well during the pandemic. They have just been shouting, and where populists have been in power, like Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they have not been doing well in fighting the pandemic. And so, they have been performing rather disastrously. So this seems to be fading away, but who knows?
Exactly. Gerard, thank you so much. This is it's been really fascinating. Let me just wrap this up by asking you. I mean, we spoke about so many interesting results, interesting topics. I mean, if you have to lay down 2 or 3 major directions for future research, I mean, what would you, say?
So maybe, let me tell you a little bit what I'm working on, several things. One thing I have been working on is sort of comparative economic history. Why is that important? Because we see today China has different institutions. It has a different culture. Now, China has a communist political regime, but there are a lot of institutional inheritance from China's imperial regime. This is what Chen Gangshu calls institutional genes. So he's writing a fascinating book. It's only in Chinese so far, and my Chinese is very, very bad. So I won't be able to read it before it's translated. But so China is very different. At the same time, it's really the rising power. Okay. And we thought in the 20th century that communism was kind of an episode, and once it was over, that the world would come back to sort of, there is one way to growth and development, which is more related to the liberal ideas. But you see that China is both economically successful, but completely autocratic, not liberal, et cetera, et cetera. And that nationalism is actually growing really fast. So to understand those differences that we do see today, we have to go back in history. And so to go back in history, I actually found, have a paper that came out in the Journal of Comparative Economics, that some countries, like Athens, usually the Mediterranean, but also, in Mexico, the Aztecs, the Mayas, etc., or in South Vietnam, the Champa Empire. Those were more like market systems, where markets were strongly developed. And then you have other systems that are very statist. Take Egypt, or ancient Egypt, or ancient China. Peasants did not have property rights over land. There was no property rights over slaves also, and the law was set up not to regulate conflicts between citizens, but between the state and the subjects. Okay, what you're not allowed to do, what kind of punishments. So when in China they say we are in favor of the rule of law, what they really mean is ruled by law. And this was an invention in China, that laws were edicted not to protect the rights of citizens, but to make oppression easier. Good example now would be, national security law in Hong Kong. So when you look at this history, looking at history documenting, documenting what the institutions of the past, we can understand better the present. And then, of course, it's fascinating, why did some countries become more statist? Why did other countries become more market related? And so in my historical research, I found that geography plays a big role. If there were no big advantages to trade, if production was very homogeneous, then you would see institutions develop that were more centralized, based on division of labor, like Adam Smith, the production of needles, that shows the advantage of division of labor, but that is within one organization. And then other people using more markets to exchange different goods. So Egypt, for example, was very homogeneous. You had cereals growing along the Nile, and then some craft production, etc. And that production was very well organized by the state, and they knew how to extract the surplus from the peasants. Whereas if you look at Mesopotamia, that's not that far. Conditions of production were more homogeneous, and there was much more trade, and they developed market institutions. So it seems that geographic conditions have certainly contributed to the rise of either statist systems, like in ancient China, ancient Egypt, or more market systems like what you have in the Mediterranean, but also the Vikings, the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, et cetera. And so by looking at history, maybe we can understand better the present.
That is great. All right. Gerard, I mean, this is really fascinating. You have covered so much. I mean, thank you very, very much for your thoughts and for talking to us. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Naro. Thank you very much.